So welcome to today's Interspecies Internet Conversations lecture. I'm Kate Armstrong. I'm Executive Director of the Interspecies Internet, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the trustees and the organisation. So Interspecies Conversations is a series of regular online talks that gives the opportunity to invite leading professors, scientists, researchers and students to share and present work that contributes to advancing the acceleration and understanding of the diversity, forms and functions of communication in other species. We like to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries and host open discussion where our community can join the conversation with ideas and feedback. So today we're joined by Tim Gardner, and his talk will be entitled TweetyBERT, Uncovering Canary Song Syntax. So Tim is an Associate Professor of Bioengineering at the Knight campus in Oregon. He earned his PhD in 2003 from the Rockefeller University in Physics and Biology. In 2009, he became a faculty member at Boston University, where his lab focused on vocal learning in zebra finches. In 2016, he moved to San Francisco to join the founding team of Neuralink, where he worked on human brain-computer interfaces. After 3 years there, he returned to working with songbirds, this time at the University of Oregon, with a focus on canaries and machine learning methods for animal vocalizations. In this presentation, Tim will delve into a self-supervised transformer model designed to automatically pass complex bird songs. Tim, please, the floor is yours. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today. We don't yet. Oh, yeah, yes. We hear you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to share some preliminary results with you. And I just really want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here. This is a fantastic organization and a wonderful mission, and I'm really delighted to be able to participate today. I recognize many names here, and I'm just really honored for the chance to speak. Hope it's interesting. The work that we're going to share is preliminary, so this is like really early days in talking about some new work in the lab, and so during the question and answer session, please ask if things aren't clear. This is kind of my first time running through some of this, so I'll try to make it as clear as possible. Yes, as Kate said, I'm going to be speaking today about the songs of canaries, primarily. This is a species that is not as commonly studied in scientific studies of vocal learning, though it really did form the origin of the field. More commonly, most researchers studying vocal learning have focused on zebra finches, which have a complex but very short song that makes it quite tractable to analyze. And some number in the community also study Bengalese finches, and there have been relatively few studies of many of the most complex singers like the canaries, just because the vocalizations are quite complex to quantify. I got my first opportunity to work with canaries as a PhD student at Rockefeller University, working with Fernando Nottebohm, and overlapped a lot with Ofer Chernikovsky at that time, who's also on the call. And I thought I'd just start by introducing a little bit of the work that we did back in that epoch, just to illustrate how beautiful the songs of canaries are and really what their capacity for learning is. And this begins with the story that canaries can develop song like all songbirds. They can develop with an innate program that guides the evolution or ontogeny of their song. And this is illustrated in this slide, which I hope you can hear. Songs of an... Did everyone hear that? Yep, so that's the song of an early young canary. And then midway And then are the audio levels okay? Sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah, we're
So
here.
that's that's the kind of accelerated transition through a self-learning process in canaries. At the same time, though, they're capable of just remarkable degrees of imitation. And so here's a song that we played to a canary. Right, so just a synthetic, artificial song, and this is what that canary imitated after practicing for many, many, many months with that song that he had heard. And so you can continue to kind of push this limit. What can canaries imitate if you just play a tape of sounds to them passively? Here's another song we played to them. And here's one of the birds that heard that song after about a year of practicing that, just on his own and freely practicing. All right. So the surprise for that particular bird and this group that we exposed to this was, first of all, that they could imitate these remarkably complex songs, but also that they rearranged those songs later. So as they entered the breeding season, this particular bird sang a song that sounded like this. Right? So they're capable of just remarkable imitation in the case of these synthetic songs, but then that process is also governed by genetic constraints and species-specific rules, and they can even forego some of those species-specific rules early in the imitation process, and then rearrange things to match the species norm according to innate constraints. So that's really another story, and this is something that I just wanted to share to introduce the complexity and beauty of these songs. Now, where do these songs come from? They are produced by a well-defined brain circuit that all funnels down to just the control of 8 muscles in the syrinx. This is similar to the human larynx, but differing in a number of respects. It's only about 1 millimeter in diameter, right? The canary produces these 120 decibel sounds, producing just incredible complexity from this organ that's only a millimeter in scale, 7 muscles. Now, if you create mathematical models of these kinds of vocal organs, in this case, a human vocal organ, you'll typically model them with 2 or 3 masses that are coupled with springs. These are the springs are like the spring constants that define the stiffness of the tissue, and then you've got air pressure in the trachea. This is a very common model for human vocal production, and we at that time studied the canaries and found a much simpler model was adequate to explain the canary song. That is, you essentially have 1 spring, 1 mass, and the control of air pressure, and basically every vocalization to first approximation could be characterized by a circular path through a control space, which was governed by pressure in the trachea or air sacs, and tension in 1 muscle of the syrinx. So essentially, most of the vocalizations are just very simple gestures that are described by a circular trajectory in this biophysical model of vocal production. So very simple circles, and we're going to come back to that later in this talk. Now, sometimes the canaries might transition smoothly among multiple syllable types, and in that case, the circular control parameters might look more like oscillations with changing frequency and changing phase between the oscillations. can essentially reproduce in biophysical models something that looks a lot like canary song with these very simple control trajectories. So remember that, and we'll come back to that later in the talk. Now, while the individual syllables are simple, the native songs of a canary are very complex. This is, this is just an example of one song. The time scale here is 1 second, but they'll frequently sing songs that are 60 seconds long, composed of 20 or 30 syllables. And the statistics and ordering of those syllables is very complex. It's not a fixed sequence, but a stochastic, more variable sequence, including the number of repeats that occur in each of these phrases. So terminology, today I'm going to refer to phrases. This is essentially just grouping together neighboring syllables. You can see the birds essentially persist on one syllable type, transition to another, the time that they're persisting in one syllable type, I'll refer to as a phrase. So the syllable is the individual unit. The phrase is the stuttered repeat of that unit. Now, recently, a postdoc in my lab, Yarden Cohen, set out to tackle canary song, and we really, for the first time in 20 years, brought canaries back into our studies as researchers, and he was undaunted by the complexity of the song. And basically, the goal he set out was to create a machine learning algorithm that could label the songs and really assist researchers in studying this more complex vocalization. And so to start that process, he worked with a number of undergraduates and created a nice data set where individual syllables were parsed with start and stop times and then labels according to the syllable type. And using that supervised data set, he basically developed a feed-forward deep neural network that takes in raw song and following the conventions of the labels given by human expert labelers, reproduces the human labeling process illustrated here. So it's a fully supervised model that essentially takes as input the spectrograms of the song, passes it through a convolutional neural network, and then into a recurrent neural network, LSTM, and at the end spits out a sequence of labels that includes both syllable labels and silences that demarcate the boundaries between them. And this is illustrated here. This is output of the network that we called TweetyNet at the time. And TweetyNet essentially has 30 different class labels, and you can see that it accurately indicates syllable 30 here. It transitions to syllable 25, and basically there's a single class for each syllable, and the weighting on that class defines the syllable type or the silence that's being produced. So it's really a very fine-grained analysis of song that reproduces marks both the boundaries, the starts and stops of syllables, as well as the identities of the syllables. Now, this is just a supervised model, and it's really accelerated our ability to annotate more canary song and also study the songs more effectively, but it still requires a significant amount of training data. And I've, I guess, deleted the axis here, but this shows the frame error rate of that model as a function of the amount of data. And I think on the right-hand side, this is 600 or 1,000 songs that have been, or 600 seconds or 1,000 seconds of song that have been manually annotated. And so the model can get down to about a 3% frame error rate with manual annotations of 600 or more seconds. But still, the effort required to do that level of detailed annotation is significant. And that transitions to the focus of today's talk, and this is the work of George Węgrowski, a student who joined my lab about a year ago, first-year PhD student in the night campus program. And we set ourselves the very, I would say, high reach goal of doing fully unsupervised identification of birdsong syllables, creating a model that could label the boundaries between syllables and classify the syllables without any supervised training data. So just listen to the songs and produce labeled sequences on output. Now, what we looked at, I think, a lot of this background research is something that George did. We converged on a model that others have also used. This is the BERT model that dates back to, I guess, the early 2018, 2019 as the first introduction. And BERT is just a language model that tries to fill in the blanks. So if you have a sentence, you mask out one of the words, and then the model progressively attempts to build a statistical understanding of language such that it can fill in the blanks in a sentence. So, dang, I'm out fishing, and a huge trout just blank my line. So after some amount of training, the model learns to fill in the word broke at this point. So this is something that we've kind of not necessarily noticed, but it's been kind of creeping into our lives rather thoroughly, even going back to 2019. At some point in the past, you would search for a Google phrase like, "Can you get medicine for someone pharmacy?" Right? An incomplete, kind of improperly phrased question. And prior to a model like BERT, you might get an answer that just is very specific to how you go fill a prescription in the pharmacy. But after the model of BERT was introduced into the Google search, Google's responses start to really understand more meaningfully the question that you're trying to ask, even if they're not well framed. And so there's an understanding that you're essentially asking if you can pick up medicine for someone else when you go to a pharmacy, right? And so you've probably gradually noticed your search answers getting a little bit more and more intuitively correct. That's thanks to models like BERT that have gotten introduced into the search process. Now, BERT takes as input text, right? And it also takes as input positional embeddings in a sequence. So this is basically a kind of a standard model. But we're now, many of us, much more familiar with GPT, right? So this is the machine learning underlying ChatGPT, OpenAI's product. And BERT is very similar structurally to ChatGPT. It's just that information can flow bidirectionally in the sequence. You're not just predicting the next token or the token at the end of a sequence of text, but also using information from the future to predict a missing token in the middle, for example. So information flows bidirectionally in a BERT model. Otherwise, it's almost equivalent to the GPT model for text. So applying these kinds of models to sound is really not straightforward, and that is because sound is not tokenized, right? We don't have sound as a sequence of discrete labels, and text models don't natively run on continuous structures like sound. And that's where a model comes in that many of you have probably heard about. This is QBERT. This is a human speech model that takes audio in and then tokenizes that audio through a process that they call the acoustic unit discovery system. It's essentially k-means clustering of little snippets of sound and turning that audio sequence into a sequence of discrete tokens that you can then run a text model on. And this has worked well for a number of fine-tuning tasks in human speech. And notably, it's also worked well for work in detection and classification of animal vocalizations. So this is the work of Masato Hajiwara at the Interspecies Project, and he took this human model, QBERT, and fine-tuned it with animal vocalizations and succeeded at doing quite well on some benchmarks for classification and detection of animal vocalizations. As you can see here in the right, the plot from his paper shows distinct animal vocalizations represented in distinct spaces using this model. So I think this is encouraging, but what we needed was something somewhat different, right? Our task is not detection of a vocalization, but we really want to parse the detailed structure of that vocalization. And for that, we need a few things. And most notably, we need a change in resolution. And for the human speech vocalization software, the TweetyBERT model operates at a fundamental resolution of 20 milliseconds. And so our first goal was to increase the temporal precision down to 3 millisecond temporal precision. And so that requires developing a new model. And then secondly, and I think very significantly, we were uncomfortable with this step of tokenization, that the process of first passing sound through something that creates discrete clusters is a very parameter-dependent process. And ideally, this would be a much less parameter-sensitive model at the output. And then finally, there were some things that we want to do to modernize the layer norm and different things like the relative positional encoding that we wanted to introduce into the model that we thought would make sense. What were we able to do? Well, I guess before I jump directly into that, I just want to emphasize that the authors of the TweetyBERT model address this concern about tokenization and clustering. And they say that the success of TweetyBERT really relies on the consistency of this unsupervised clustering step rather than the intrinsic quality of the assigned cluster labels. So it's not the case that those clusters have to be excellent in some deep biological sense. It's just that clustering process needs to be consistent across runs. So I don't want to dismiss models that include a clustering step and a tokenization step, but I think it's much cleaner if we could avoid that entirely. Just work with raw audio, have no clustering and no parameters associated with tokenization of an audio sequence. Okay, so George was able to do this, and just to kind of jump directly to the results, this is a transformer model that is structurally quite similar to TweetyBERT, operating on a faster time scale, but significantly it removes the tokenization step entirely. So there's no clustering, and the model essentially takes a song spectrogram computed with 2.7, I guess it's 2.7 second window. Each column in this spectrogram is 2.7 milliseconds. We just have 100 time steps in our context window here as illustrated. And we mask out the portion of that spectrogram that we want the model to learn to predict. And without any tokenization step, the model, after much iteration and self-supervised learning, is able to produce on output the spectral structure that was missing in the blanks of the model. And so this process involves a lightweight convolutional front end to the spectrogram. We've introduced layer norm, which really helps that training at a couple points. We've replaced absolute position encoding with relative position encoding, but otherwise it's a pretty straightforward transformer model. And this transformer block is repeated, some number of, I think, 12 or 16 times. So it's a fairly deep model, at the end of the day. Now, here's another example of, the pre-input to the model and output after training. So here we've masked out quite a few segments of that song, and you can see that the model accurately, after about many, I would say, a couple hours of training on a single GPU, right? So this is still a desktop machine that's running to train about 10 hours of song for an individual. It learns to predict and fill in the sequence and fill in the gaps pretty accurately in terms of reproducing the missing spectral structure. And details, it's I think that this version of the model had 2.5 million parameters, was trained on 10 hours of Canary song. And I really want to emphasize, this is not this isn't a foundation model yet. We're not training on, the whole corpus of Canary song, but really developing a specific model for a specific bird at this stage. And I think that's something that'll be interesting to discuss, the relative value of generalized foundation models versus a model that's trained just to reproduce a single bird song. And so what I'm talking about today is that focused model on a single bird. So moving pretty quickly through this, what we found, let me jump back here really quick. The output of this model is, if the model works well, the output actually matches the input. So we can't use that output layer as the layer that we're focused on for discovery of syllables, because it's no different than the input space if it's correct. And so what we did is we spent a lot of time investigating the interior representation of this model at some point prior to the output. So there's layers embedded in this model that we found had really interesting properties for I would say intrinsically understanding the structure of the canary song. And we'll see more of what that means here in a second. But we've focused on a layer that's 2 or 3 layers prior to the output of the model. And we found that we could just train a linear classifier on the states of that interior layer. And that linear classifier does as well as our fine-tuned TweetyNet model or TweetyBERT fine-tuned. That linear probe in terms of frame error rates is comparable to these supervised models that we had developed especially for the purpose of syllable classification. By comparison, linear probes applied directly to the spectrogram do much more poorly. And this shows kind of the performance of these classifiers for 20 different syllables in one bird. If we try to apply that classifier directly to the spectrograms, the error rate is nearly almost 100%. But applied to any of these new models, the error rate can be quite low, though somewhat variable from syllable type to syllable type. Now, what this basically tells us that the model has an internal representation that's useful for parsing canary song, but it's not yet automatically generating the labels, right? So how can we do that? Well, what we did was just do dimensionality reduction of this interior layer of the model at 2.7 millisecond resolution. And so I'll unpack this here for a second. What I'm showing in the middle panel here is UMAP, a low dimensional representation of the spectrogram of a canary song that is colored by the ground truth labels. So these are supervised human labels that were applied to the sequence. And you can see that if you just do dimensionality reduction on single columns of a spectrogram, that is not a great representation of individual syllables. But if we do that same 2.7 millisecond resolution dimensionality reduction on the TweetyBERT model, what we see are clusters that correspond really nicely to the human ground truth labels. And black in this case is silence that occurs between syllables. And so a phrase of a canary song we find is basically just a loop around a circle in this space. And each of these colors represents a distinct syllable label from the human labels. And so this is really the most important figure in the talk, and that is just that in a fully self-supervised process with no human supervision whatsoever, the process of just predicting gaps in the spectrogram creates an internal representation that this model develops, which very closely aligns with the way humans label these sequences as distinct syllables. And I think quite interestingly, these clusters are not, not just like dense clusters, but they're actually circles. And if you recall at the beginning of the talk, I suggested that the fundamental biophysics of vocal production in canaries is that every single one of those syllables is a small circle in biophysical control space. So pressure of the air sacs on one axis and tension of a single muscle, the ventrosyncytialis muscle, on another axis. And so what we've been really surprised to see is that this model uncovers circular representations of each of these syllables that I think corresponds very nicely to the fundamental biophysics of vocal production. So this is, I think, really encouraging for the value of a self-supervised process, even in the absence of any clustered tokenization of the sequence, right? So this is almost a parameter-free process. It's just audio in, audio out, and very, there's nothing to tune in this model. There's no clustering step, right? Which was the step that always takes a lot of difficulty in tuning. Wanted to ask Kate, how am I doing for time?
Fine.
Okay.
I think you're doing fine. Thanks.
Good. We're close to finishing up on this. Now, let's move forward here. I just showed you the ground truth labels. These are colored by human labels. We can run an unsupervised clustering on this space, and this is using a clustering method called HDB scan. And what you can see is, that kind of nicely parses out many of these individual syllables, and you can see on the right pretty good correspondence to the ground truth labels, and by comparison, if you just do that same HDB scan clustering on the spectrogram, this is not actually a really fair comparison. We optimized the HDB scan parameters for TweetyBERT, so I wouldn't draw too many conclusions here, other than the fact that it's essentially merged into just one big cluster, right? The acoustic separation of the syllables in spectral space is really inadequate to cluster this data. But the internal representation of TweetyBERT is actually biophysically separable in a very simple way, and we can cluster that data. Okay. So, just throwing some numbers out, how good is the clustering? We see an adjusted RAND score of 0.93, so that, one is perfect correspondence between the human labels and the automated clusters. And with this first version of TweetyBERT, we're at 0.93. So it's really an excellent match to the human labels. Other cluster metrics, the score for TweetyBERT is compared to same clustering applied to the sonogram by V measure. They're very, very, very distinct and excellent performance on the TweetyBERT clusters. Okay, so basically at this point, and this is really pretty hot off the presses, where I'm talking about stuff that we kind of really just first saw indications that this was working in the last few months, and so now the opportunity, I would say, for us and for the larger community is to apply it and really kind of put this through its paces. And so we now have an ability to automatically parse Canary song, label the syllables, and really address the question of what is the nature of this complex syntax in a Canary. Can we really describe statistically the structure of song, and now how does that change in different social settings, for example? And these are all future questions. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of first things that we see when we run statistical models on the clusters for Canary song. And just by way of introducing that, I'm going to point back to this classic paper by Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, from the Bell Systems Technical Journal. And he talks about zeroth order approximations to language, right? So here's a zeroth order approximation. Symbols are independent and equiprobable. That's not a very good representation of human speech, right? Or human language. We can advance to first order word approximations. So now individual words are present in the statistics of their natural occurrence in language. This also doesn't generate a great representation of speech, but it's slightly more naturalistic. We can move forward to second order word approximations. So now this starts to sound a little bit like speech, right? Where you look at the pairwise probabilities of words and can generate sequences in language that match those pairwise probabilities. So we have, the head and in frontal attack on an English writer, that the character of this point is therefore another method for the letters. Kind of sounds speech-like, but clearly second order word approximations are not adequate to describe language. Now, our question was, what order is necessary to describe the sequence of phrases in Canary song? Is it first order, second order, higher order? And the process that we use to do that is building what's called a probabilistic suffix tree. So this essentially takes a syllable and it asks, what information do I need to know about the past in order to optimally predict what the bird is going to do next from a given syllable? And so a simple first order Markov process would look like this pink case where there's no history that defines what the bird does next. It's just a first order Markov process. Every decision is essentially a random decision from the current state of the bird. A second order Markov process would look back one syllable and say, okay, what I'm going to do next depends on what I just sang. So, the previous phrase and the current phrase will impact the probabilities of the subsequent phrase. And then here I illustrate on the right a fifth order Markov process where you have to look back 5 phrases to predict what the bird's going to do next. And the process to build these statistical trees, one common process in language analysis is the building of a probabilistic suffix tree. And so there's algorithms to do that. It's well established technically. And that's what we did when we applied this to the output of TweetyBERT. And what we see when we do that is this figure needs some refinement, but basically here in pink is an illustration of a syllable that follows a first order Markov process in the Canary song, that basically it doesn't matter what the bird did before, what it does next is really just defined by the fact that it's currently singing syllable E. In contrast, here's another syllable L, which is an extremely complex syllable, that what the bird does next after syllable L depends up to 3 syllables prior. And I mistermed this syllable. It's really 3 phrases prior. We'll get back to this. This is some validation in which we analyze basically the optimal statistical depth of the probabilistic suffix tree for 6 birds. So you can basically see at what point you start to overfit the sequence and kind of misreport a high order Markov process. And for all 6 of these birds, the optimal Markov depth is on the order of 4 to 5 phrases. So that means it's a 4th or 5th order Markov process in the phrases of the Canary song. And that's just illustrated here in another figure. First order syllables are here. So these are all the simple syllables, so to speak. And then you've got some syllables, a subset, that are the complex syllables. And these guys really depend on the probabilities of what they do next from syllable N depend on the history of what they sang in the past. So going back up to 5 or 10 seconds in songs. So it really indicates that the birds have a kind of a history dependence of about at least 5 seconds, where they're kind of maintaining a working memory of the song structure that they just produced, and that impacts the sounds that they're going to produce next. What does this look like practically? This is all statistics. On a sonogram, what would be an example of that? So here's an example where the bird sings a sequence of 4 phrases and then transitions to this dark blue if it was preceded by the orange phrase. But if it was preceded by this brown phrase, it transitions to black. Or if it was preceded by the red phrase, it transitions again to dark blue. So this is kind of what these kinds of rules look like at the level of spectrograms. You get these long-range correlations where what the bird does from this point in time depends on what he was doing all the way back about 5 seconds earlier. Here's another example. Orange and pink will go to purple. If it was preceded by red, orange and pink goes to yellow if it was preceded by blue. So these are the kinds of things that these probabilistic suffix trees are turning up. And you can basically invert one of those probabilistic suffix trees into a syntax model. So this is basically what would a syntax model look like to generate that particular bird's song? And there's not much take home here other than it's a really complex spaghetti of connected statistical transitions. And so we think now that with this TweetyBERT model, we're basically at a point where we can analyze very efficiently the statistical structure of canary song, and we think this will generalize to other birds as well, and other animals. And so I think the hope is really to now speak to the community and hear from everyone about ways that we might be able to further validate this and use this in areas that people are interested in. Personally, one of our next projects in the lab we're diving deeper into the Canary song statistics and looking at social context and different ways that the syntax might change, but also starting to look at the songs of even more complex singers, like the warble song of budgerigars is one example of a song that's been really hard to, I would say, analyze statistically, just due to the variability of the individual notes. And we've had some really encouraging preliminary results from the budgerigar song as well. And so stay tuned on that front. Just want to conclude and open up questions. This is the Canary team over the years. Current team is pictured here on the left, and Yarden Cohen responsible for the TweetyNet, the supervised model that I started the description with. He's currently a professor at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And George Vengrovsky, the graduate student that's just starting his trajectory through the PhD process with the TweetyBERT model. And Melissa Bemrose, Ananya Kapoor, and Rose have been really closely involved in other aspects of the same work and variants of the model that we hope to talk about later. Jeff Markowitz did some of the early statistical analysis of Canary song, and he's a faculty member at Georgia Tech currently. And David Nicholson has closely worked with Yarden on some of the supervised learning models, and importantly on the distribution of these models. This is something that Yarden and David have done really well for TweetyNet. They've got a good number of users that have used that, and now we'd really like to follow their example and find the best way to disseminate these models and really make it something that the community can use very, very efficiently and effectively. And we think it's a pretty unique model because of the time scale, the very short, high temporal resolution, right? This is not a model that was developed for human speech, but really adapted to be appropriate for the high speed temporal resolution of the bird songs. And we think because there's no clustering step, this is really going to apply to basically to a wide variety of vocalizations, right? We don't have to tune this process. It's essentially a black box that has no tunable parameters. It's just predicting spectrograms. Spectrograms as input, spectrograms as output, and no clustering in the process. And kind of through the miracle of this self-supervised learning, the model's developing meaningful internal representations of animal vocalizations that we think will really allow us to now begin to efficiently study how these vocalizations change and are used in different social contexts. So with that, I'll conclude and be delighted to take questions.
Fantastic, Tim. We do have some questions. Actually, we have many questions. We already have Offer with his hand raised, and we have two other questions in the chat. So let's go to Offer, and then we can see if Artem would like to ask the question. Otherwise, I can also facilitate that. So Offer?
Tim, this is a great talk, really exciting. Thank you. I have one question about the circles that we see in the UMAP of the DEEP model. If you take the phase of those circles and plot it in the time domain, will the phase reset during each syllable, or is it going to reset over the entire phrase? The reason that I'm asking that is because I really always very iffy about models that are tokenized, because the song is not language, and a lot of the meaning of the song, as we both know, is that what we call type is not exactly type. There are transitions during, there's maybe some kind of an acceleration or slight increase, so there's preparation from one side to the other, and I was wondering if those circles may capture that, and in that respect also, is it even, you think, going to be a final step to look at it as a sequence, or maybe if we did a model that take that phase into account, we could actually have a much more meaningful model biologically?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting and important question. And we've just started analyzing the structure of the individual clusters, but I can say that the canaries phase resets once per syllable. So basically, as the bird stutters a syllable, it's traversing over and over that loop. And I think it's maybe even more clear. Well,
right. So the model doesn't capture the transition that happens in a phrase, right?
Well, it does. It does in that some of the syllables are very stereotyped, right? So there's very little acoustic variation from the beginning of the phrase to the next. And that would be captured in something like this, reddish syllable near my cursor, where it's an extremely tight circle. This one, these larger clusters, by comparison, are syllables that show continuous variation in pitch from the beginning of the phrase to the end of the phrase. And so as the phrase is traversed, you're basically cycling around this, but moving, kind of moving concentrically out or in on one of these circles, and that captures the variation in the acoustic structure or the timing of the syllables. This can be pitch or duration of the syllables. And so what we're really excited by the fact that it basically groups together all these variants of the syllable into a single cluster. The cluster is smeared, right? It's not as tight as the extremely stereotyped syllables, but it's still grouped together as a single coherent object. And that's something that is really challenging to do with syllables that have like temporal variation if you're applying a more standard windowed dimensionality reduction method. So yeah, I think Ofer, this is going to be really interesting to look at in more detail. Would love to talk with you further about that.
Yeah, thank you. It's beautiful. Thanks.
Artem, I see you have your camera on. Would you like to ask your question to Tim?
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you, Tim. Excellent talk. Super cool stuff. I was curious, if we're interested in discrete representations at the end, why do we discard Hubert then? Hubert is basically discrete tokens, right? And UMAP are both discrete tokens. So like so they both discrete. Why do we basically prefer, or why did you guys prefer one over another? It's just like curious to hear how like what was your thinking?
Yeah, I think the initial motivation was really trying to get to a model that was as parameter free as possible. And so having to choose things like, the number of clusters in your k-means clustering step is one more parameter. I'm not going to argue fundamentally that was a super important decision. However, getting back to Ofer's question, we do see that for many of these syllable classes, there's a lot of variation. So like the time scale is changing or the pitch is changing. And, I think it would be interesting to go back to the clustered version of Hubert if we made a high resolution version of Hubert that was appropriate for the birds and, see if it can kind of capture the essential sameness of all of those syllables that have acoustic variations. I think every one of those syllables, when when the pitch changes continuously, those would need to be represented by distinct tokens. I think, though there's some subtlety to that, and we really are very happy that the output of this network essentially groups all of those shape variations into a single cluster. And maybe you can do that with discrete tokens, but I think it would be harder.
Yeah. Super cool. Thank you. I'm just asking because we're doing something similar for capuchin monkeys, but with discrete representation. So, and I'm curious now to try continuous. Maybe it will be better.
Yeah, we'd be very happy to chat further about that. I think this will generalize to any animal vocalization challenge, and we can get away from tokenization is really the hope. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Artem. That's a potential collaboration. So that's really exciting. I hope that can be fruitful. We have another question from Jamie in the chat. Would you like to ask that, Jamie, or I can also...
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, just curious. I'm guessing that because it's such a different task, there's probably not so much transfer learning from other pre-trained tasks, but curious whether you completely randomize weights from scratch or if there are any layers that you're keeping from the existing structure as you do the fine-tuning.
Yeah, so to get to the clustering step, there's no fine-tuning, right? So we do what we've been doing until now is essentially randomizing the weights initially for each bird, right? So there's basically a new model developed for each bird. We're just now starting to explore the potential value of adding multiple birds into more of like a Canary Foundation model to see if if that improves the representations, and I think it will. I think the initial indication is that the representations are further improved and the learning is faster. But until now, they've really been bird specific, individual specific models, and I think this is going to be a really interesting question for the future to see how much we can leverage pre-training on other individuals from a given species. But I think that's definitely going to improve things to the extent that we can do that. You know, I think it's an interesting question though for the field is if we want a really specific answers from a given species, you know, it's not clear to me that we want to train a model on anything but that species, right? I think this is going to be one of the questions that the field's going to probably need to grapple with. You know, I think right now my intuition is that this is probably working as well as it is because it's been a canary specific model, right? I'm not sure that I can say that with any certainty, but you know, I don't want to at this stage mix in primate and pig and whale vocalizations into this model. For one, because they're just operating on such different timescales, right? That it seems like the biophysics of vocal production from the whale and the bird can be very, very similar, but on very, very different timescales. And so if we're going to combine across animals to create foundation models, at a minimum, I think there should be some kind of biophysical renormalization to kind of match timescales of, you know, but that, yeah, this will be an interesting thing to discuss further.
Great. We have another question in the chat around what are the specific details of the potential of this application. So this kind of technology could be applied for specifically scientific research and or conservation. How do you foresee this being used, and what do you think maybe even what is most powerful? Yeah. Application.
Yeah, potential applications. Well, you know, for our initial focus, we can now ask some questions that are just very, very natural to ask, like, how does the statistics of the birdsong change, you know, in the morning versus in the afternoon, right? Is there, you know, can we just describe statistically the structure of what they're doing at different times of day, or in different social settings when they're singing alone versus, you know, in a group? Does the statistical structure of the songs that they're producing depend on who they're singing to, whether it's a male or a female? And you know, so these are just very natural questions that are, you know, just kind of the beginning of a first order description of what they're really doing that haven't been tractable in an efficient way previously. Now that's just like the first next step. I would love to see whether or not these, you know, species-specific transformer models can also be useful for conservation and detection, right? I would love to think that we might be able to build more sample-efficient detectors, for example, by having a specialized self-supervised model trained on a species that you could then apply to maybe use less supervised data to build a good detector for that species in a conservation setting. And this isn't my expertise, but you know, I would love to see applications like that. And mostly, you know, this community, I think I really would love to hear feedback from you guys on how to use it. You know, from my perspective, the starting point's just a more thorough description of the statistics of animal vocalizations, and then start to progressively see how the context, the environmental context changes that. And so we'll be hopefully applying this to some dolphin vocalizations in the near future, and the parrot work. So I think we'll have more answers to these questions soon, and would love to disseminate the model so you guys can explore your own variations on that too.
Yeah, I think, Tim, it's absolutely the right place for those discussions, because we have so many people in the room who are really working on the variety of species that you've discussed, and also, you know, those applications which are really driven by this conservation and welfare agenda. So I think we're really collaborating in the right place. So that's fantastic, and I hope that we can kind of work on that dissemination, as you mentioned. We have another question from Treasure. Go ahead.
Good morning, Tim. Thank you all for being here. I have a few questions, but the one that mainly I wanted to bring up, because it kind of touches on your last topic, is while researching birdsong, I discovered information that states that birdsong causes nearby plants to open their stomata, which are pores under the leaves that open and close during day to ingest and eject gases in the leaf for plant metabolism. Is there any plan or any correlation between birdsong and their interaction with plants in the environment? And it has recently been proven also that plants communicate amongst each other in a vocal range. So perhaps the birdsong could be responding to noises or things that plants are actually emitting. So there seems to be, is there any plants that have any studies with an interaction with birds in their environment and the plants that they typically need for their lifestyle?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not personally working on that. Though I did have a student recently propose to do some electrophysiology on mushrooms and try to understand the internal communications of mushrooms in the group. So maybe we'll be moving in that direction too. But no, I don't personally work on that, but I think this would be a really interesting thing to explore. Yeah.
Perhaps again, we can find somebody who is working on that in the community. I don't know if there's anyone around in that field, but I think that's a really interesting discussion about, also the symbiotic relationship between those two, plants and birds, and maybe we can actually understand more about the bird through the plants. So that's very, very interesting provocation. Thanks, Treasure.
Yeah.
We have another question from Jeff. If anybody does work on that field, please pop in the chat and or jump in, because that would be fantastic to hear. Jeff, you don't happen to work in the field, do you? In plants and birds?
No. Tim, thank you. Question back to your conservation mention. We have a large data set of wild wolves, and it correlates to how wolves are managed by agencies for population numbers and pack size. And so detection with acoustic recorders is kind of a big thing right now in the Rocky Mountains. In your TweetyBERT, what I was thinking about with our data set is how noisy can that data set be? Because we're talking about sometimes you have individuals, sometimes you have multiple wolves howling over one another. And then of course you have chorus howls. So maybe it's just some guidance on the limitations you've seen versus the lab versus the real world. Right.
Yeah. Well, I can't speak with any certainty on that. So far it's just been ideal recordings in ideal, but I guess the kind of program that I would propose for the conservation effort would be to really explore this more thoroughly. And I think the basic proposal is develop something like TweetyBERT specific for the species that you're interested in. And maybe you can even train it on recordings that are, for example, in a rescue setting or population of, I guess one group we're talking with is looking at spider monkeys, right? And so if you go to a spider monkey rescue and just kind of record all the chaos of everything that's happening in that environment, still try to train that self-supervised model to predict this complex setting, now augment with noise as well. So you kind of train the model to be robust to background noise, and then see if that model ends up being useful for, detection and classification with, say, fewer training samples than other models. I think that's a whole research program, and it's one we're really, really interested in, but I don't have answers for you yet.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Potential other applications for the work that you're presenting, Tim. Anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask at this point of the discussion? You can also pop those in the chat if you want. I think we've had some really fascinating information. I think we're all quite quite curious about the application of this, and I think that that's the next steps that I feel that that we also presented today, Tim, was because that was kind of the question that is out there. How else can this be used in the community? Oh yes, Treasure, you had another question, of course.
Yes, thank you. Just a practical question. Can you associate any of vocalizations with actions, items, feelings, etc. from the individual bird? Like, do they make a certain sound if they're hungry or if they feel threatened? Or have you been able to correlate through the AI any type of a reasonable pattern of speech or communication as we would understand it?
Yeah, I think that's really important and really next steps. So we just got this model working in the last month or two. So it's really early days to be talking about it to the group. But I think that's really the hope, right? Is that we can go in that direction and we and others can use it to really make some of those important associations. Certainly the field, there's a lot known even in canaries about different syllables in different contexts. There's a beautiful story associated with some of the innate syllables that these birds learn are some of the most complex syllables that they produce are fully innate. So they don't imitate those syllables. They're always just kind of added to their song without imitation. And they're known to be particularly attractive to their mates. So they've been called sexy syllables, right? So there are some associations with the breeding season, for example, that these very fast two-voiced syllables, seems like there's a very strong backup plan to always add those into the song, no matter what the bird's been tutored with. And that's because turns out the females really like those for the male singers. And so there's some stories of, like that really go back decades. We haven't uncovered anything new yet with this model. We're just at the stage of benchmarking it and convincing ourselves that it's going to be useful for future studies. But it's a great question.
Thank you. And my last question is kind of silly, but the old canary in a coal mine use, did the miners use the bird to detect poisonous gas by simply dying, or did the bird sound an alarm to the presence of dangerous gases that the coal miners learned to interpret?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I've always imagined it that the birds just expire and they notice it, but I bet they fall silent, right? I bet they stop chirping, and and that's the sign. But yeah, the history of canaries is wonderful. The breeding for beautiful songs goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. The Harz Mountains in Germany. One of the species we study, can be traced about 500 years back in terms of bird fanciers that kept that species. King George was a canary aficionado, and he trained canaries with music boxes, right? So the synthetic tutoring song that I described today was there's some history for that as well. So there's wonderful stories to be told about canaries, I think.
Jeff. Oh, we don't hear you. You can unmute.
Yep, there you go.
Awesome.
Sorry, we're lucky to have you. So I just wanted to ask one more question. I don't know if you've seen Arnund's and Kirby's recent paper on the statistical structure of human language and how it's culturally learned. But it goes back to this syllable differentiation as a statistical model, and then a Zipfian distribution as well. And I'm wondering if you guys ran any distributions on both the phrases and the syllables based on this recent data set to see what's going on.
No, we haven't yet. And so I hope I get a chance to speak again once our science is advanced a little further on this. We're just at the point where we're so excited that we can use this model, and we're convinced that it's going to be useful, but we don't have those new results. We have noticed that there's a strong correlation between the transition statistics from a given phrase and how much time the bird spends repeating that syllable. So everything I talked about today was just a phrase level Markov model, but every one of those phrases is composed of many repeats of a syllable, and there's like a kind of long tail distribution of the length of a given phrase. And so the statistical correlations go way beyond what I've talked about today, because those phrase lengths also impact the transition statistics. And so we don't actually know what's going to be the best way to describe that full full model that incorporates both syllable level statistics and phrase level statistics. But you're touching on exactly an interesting question for the future. I love these questions. I'm so delighted to learn about this group, and I'm looking forward to participating in future meetings with you guys.
I think that's exactly it, Tim. When, this space is really for our, feedback and discussion and exploring this new research. So I think you've presented us today with something, as you say, that's really in its kind of first stages of being adopted and utilized within the community. And I believe that you're also very open for people to contact you regarding this and to get in touch.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So if anybody is interested, Tim and the team are really interested in collaborating further and looking at the different applications for this model and how that can actually advance our field and our community. And you can always jump on the Slack, which is now in the chat, and it's also found in the YouTube. And you can also, I believe, Tim, you're on the Slack. So if anybody wants to get in touch and ask extra questions, then he'll be able to answer there. I think in general, this is probably, one of these moments that maybe in 6, 12, 18 months time, we'll all be back in this space again and seeing some further collaborations and further development of the research, because that's really what this space enables us to do. So thank you very, very much, Tim. If there's no further questions, I think we can close it up and give a very warm thank you for your very generous discussion here today, very generous description of the research, and also the ability to ask so many questions and have so much great feedback. We really appreciate it, and we're very excited to see where this goes. And as I said, we will see you, we hope, online with multiple new collaborations for the tech.
Thank you, Kate. And I just want to emphasize, definitely reach out to me on the Interspecies Slack or directly by email, whichever is easiest. We'd love to be collaborating with folks on this. And if you know of people that might like to, get involved in the software effort, we could always use more programmers in this project. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a really great weekend. See you next time.